The execution order arrived at dawn. Sister Marie-Thérèse was kneeling in the chapel of the Convent of St. Agnes when she heard the motorcycles roaring up the mountain road. She knew that sound. German military couriers, moving fast, carrying orders that couldn't wait for the regular mail. In 4 years of occupation, she had learned to read the sounds of war the way other nuns read scripture. It was February 1945, in the mountains of northern Italy, and the war was turning against the Reich. The Allies were pushing north from Rome. The partisans were growing bolder in the hills, and the German garrison commanders were growing desperate. Desperate men did desperate things, and the 200 Allied prisoners in the camp below the convent, British, American, Canadian, South African, men captured in North Africa and Sicily, and the long bloody crawl up the Italian boot, were about to become victims of that desperation. The Mother Superior intercepted the courier at the gate. Sister Marie-Thérèse watched from the chapel window as the man handed over an envelope, saluted, and roared back down the mountain. She watched the Mother Superior's face as she read the contents. She watched the color drain from the old woman's cheeks. 10 minutes later, the Mother Superior found her in the chapel. "The commandant has received orders from Berlin," the old nun said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The prisoners are to be executed before the Allies arrive. All of them. They begin tomorrow at sunrise. 200 men. Fathers and sons, husbands and brothers. Men who had survived the desert and the mountains and years of captivity, only to be murdered in the final weeks of a war that everyone knew was already lost." Sister Marie-Thérèse looked at the crucifix above the altar. Then she looked at the Mother Superior. "How long do we have?" 18 hours. Perhaps less. 18 hours to save 200 lives, and Sister Marie-Thérèse had an idea so dangerous, so forbidden, that it could get her excommunicated, imprisoned, or shot. She was going to try it anyway. To understand what Sister Marie-Thérèse faced that morning, you have to understand what the final months of the war had become in northern Italy. The German occupation was collapsing, but it was collapsing violently. As the Allies advanced, the Wehrmacht and the SS enacted increasingly brutal reprisals against anyone suspected of aiding the enemy. The POW camps were a particular problem. The Germans had scattered thousands of Allied prisoners across northern Italy, using them as labor for farms and factories. As the front lines moved north, these prisoners became liabilities, mouths to feed, bodies to guard, potential threats if they escaped and joined the partisans. Berlin's solution was simple: kill them all before they could be liberated. The order had already been carried out in several camps. At Fossoli, the SS had machine-gunned 67 prisoners in a single afternoon. At San Saba, hundreds had been executed in the camp's crematorium. The pattern was clear. As the Germans retreated, they left behind mass graves instead of witnesses. The camp below the Convent of St. Agnes held the largest concentration of Allied prisoners in the region. 200 men from a dozen nations, guarded by a battalion of increasingly nervous German soldiers. The commandant, a Wehrmacht major named Klaus Brenner, was not an evil man by the standards of the war. He had treated the prisoners correctly, allowed Red Cross inspections, even permitted the nuns from the convent to visit with food and medicine. But Brenner was also a soldier who followed orders. And the order from Berlin was unambiguous: no prisoners were to fall into Allied hands alive. The Church had tried to intervene in such matters before. Bishops had written letters, cardinals had made appeals, the Vatican itself had issued protests. None of it had stopped the killing. The German military machine was beyond the reach of moral persuasion. It understood only force, fear, and the chain of command. Sister Marie-Thérèse understood something else. She understood that even the most hardened soldiers had souls, and souls could be reached by methods that armies could not counter. Marie-Thérèse Beaumont was born in Lyon, France, in 1898, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress. She grew up in a household where books were treasured and learning was prized above material wealth. By 12, she could read Latin, Greek, and Italian. By 16, she had decided to enter the religious life. She joined the Sisters of St. Agnes in 1918, just as the First World War was ending. The order was small, contemplative, devoted to prayer and the education of young women. Marie-Thérèse took her vows expecting a life of quiet service, teaching, praying, growing old in the peaceful rhythm of convent life. But God, it seemed, had other plans. In 1936, the order sent her to their convent in northern Italy, high in the mountains above a small town that would later become the site of a POW camp. She learned Italian, taught local girls, and developed a reputation for two things: her extraordinary memory for scripture, and her unusual gift for understanding people. Sister Marie-Thérèse could look at you and see straight through to your soul, one of her former students remembered. It wasn't frightening, it was comforting. You felt like she understood everything about you, even the parts you tried to hide. And somehow, she made you want to be better than you were. When the war came to Italy, the convent became a refuge. The nuns sheltered escaped prisoners, hidden Jews, partisan fighters wounded in the mountains. They did it quietly, carefully, always maintaining the fiction of neutrality that protected them from German reprisals. Sister Marie-Thérèse coordinated much of this work, using her understanding of human nature to know which Germans could be bribed, which could be deceived, and which had to be avoided entirely. But she had never attempted anything like what she was about to try. What she was planning wasn't just dangerous, it was, by the strict letter of church law, forbidden. The technique she intended to use had been banned by the Vatican for over a century, condemned as manipulation, as psychological coercion, as a violation of the free will that God had given to every human soul. Sister Marie-Thérèse didn't care. 200 men were going to die at sunrise, and she had 18 hours to stop it. The technique was called directed meditation, and it had been developed by Jesuit missionaries in the 17th century as a method for converting reluctant pagans. The basic principle was simple: instead of preaching at a subject, you guided them through a series of mental images and emotional states that led them, step by step, to the conclusion you wanted them to reach. It was prayer as persuasion, meditation as manipulation. The Vatican had banned it in 1823, ruling that it violated the subject's free will and constituted a form of spiritual coercion. Any priest or nun who used the technique faced immediate excommunication. Sister Marie-Thérèse had learned about it only by accident, discovering a forbidden text in the convent's ancient library, a text that should have been destroyed 2 centuries ago. She had studied it out of intellectual curiosity, never intending to use it. But she had remembered it, and now, with 200 lives hanging in the balance, she was going to put it into practice. The key to directed meditation was understanding your subject. You couldn't guide someone to a conclusion that was completely foreign to their nature. You could only amplify what was already there, bring to the surface thoughts and feelings that the subject had suppressed or ignored. It worked not by creating new beliefs but by awakening dormant ones, and Sister Marie-Thérèse knew something about Major Klaus Brenner that she suspected he had forgotten himself. She had been visiting the camp for 3 years, bringing food and medicine, hearing confessions from the Catholic prisoners, conducting small services in the camp's makeshift chapel. She had watched Brenner during these visits, studied him the way she studied everyone. She had seen the way he looked away when the guards were too rough with the prisoners. She had seen the rosary beads he kept hidden in his desk drawer. She had seen the photograph of his children on his wall, and the way his eyes went soft when he looked at it. Klaus Brenner was a Catholic, a lapsed one, a conflicted one, a man who had buried his faith under years of military discipline and wartime necessity. But the faith was still there, dormant, waiting. Sister Marie-Thérèse was going to wake it up. She requested a meeting with the commandant at noon, ostensibly to discuss the prisoners' spiritual needs before what she called the difficult days ahead. Brenner agreed. He had always been courteous to the nuns, perhaps out of residual Catholic guilt, perhaps out of simple decency. He had no idea what was coming. Sister Marie-Thérèse arrived at the camp precisely at 12, carrying only her rosary and a small Bible. The guards escorted her to Brenner's office, a cramped room in a stone building that had once been a farmhouse. The major was waiting behind his desk, looking tired and older than his 45 years. "Sister," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Thank you for coming. I assume you've heard about the orders." "I have heard," she said. "I've come to pray with you." Brenner looked uncomfortable. "I'm not sure that's appropriate, sister. I have a great deal to prepare." "Major Brenner." She leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "In 18 hours, you are going to order the deaths of 200 men, men with wives and children, mothers and fathers, men who have committed no crime except being captured by the enemy. Whatever your orders say, whatever your duty demands, you know in your heart that what you are about to do is murder." Brenner's face went pale. "Sister, I must ask you to leave." "I will leave. But first, I ask you to pray with me. Just for a few minutes." Whatever happens tomorrow, you will need God's grace to endure it. Surely you can spare a few minutes for your immortal soul. She saw the conflict in his eyes, duty against conscience, orders against faith. She saw him glance at the photograph of his children, at the hidden drawer where she knew he kept his rosary. "For a few minutes," he said finally. "No more." What happened over the next 3 hours would later be described by Brenner himself in a testimony given to Allied investigators after the war. He called it the most extraordinary spiritual experience of my life. He also called it something very close to witchcraft. Sister Marie-Thérèse began with conventional prayers, the Our Father, the Hail Mary, familiar words that Brenner had learned as a child and hadn't spoken in decades. She recited them slowly, rhythmically, her voice soft and hypnotic. She asked him to close his eyes, to breathe deeply, to let the words wash over him. Then she began the directed meditation. "Imagine yourself as a child," she said, "in your mother's arms, safe, loved, innocent. You are in church, and the light is coming through the stained glass windows, and you can smell the incense, and you know that God loves you. Remember that feeling, Klaus. Remember what it was like to believe." She guided him through his memories, his first communion, his confirmation, the prayers he had said with his mother before bed. She made him remember the man he had been before the war, before the uniform, before the orders that had slowly stripped away his humanity. She spoke of his children, asked him what he would want them to know about their father, asked him if he could look them in the eyes after tomorrow. And then she began to speak of judgment. "You will die someday, Klaus. We all will, and when you stand before God, He will ask you about tomorrow. He will show you the faces of every man you killed, not in battle, not in self-defense, but in cold blood, because someone in Berlin told you to. He will show you their wives receiving the telegrams. He will show you their children growing up without fathers. And He will ask you, was it worth your soul?" Brenner was weeping now, his military composure shattered. 3 hours of directed meditation had broken through defenses he had spent years building. He was no longer a Wehrmacht major following orders. He was a frightened Catholic facing eternal damnation. "What can I do?" he whispered. "The orders come from Berlin. If I disobey, they will shoot me and find someone else to carry them out." "Delay," Sister Marie-Thérèse said. "That's all you have to do. The Allies are coming. Everyone knows the war is lost. If you can delay the execution for even 2 or 3 days, the Americans will be here. The orders will become meaningless. The prisoners will live, and you will not have their blood on your hands." "How?" "Berlin expects confirmation. If I don't report that the orders have been carried out, lie." The word hung in the air between them. "Send a message saying the execution is proceeding as ordered. By the time they realize the truth, it will be too late. The Americans will be here. The war will be over. And you will be able to face your God and your children, knowing that you chose mercy over murder." Brenner stared at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the rosary beads he had hidden there for years. "Help me pray," he said. "Help me find the courage." The next 72 hours were the longest of Sister Marie-Thérèse's life. Brenner sent the false report to Berlin, claiming that preparations for the execution were underway and that it would be completed within 48 hours. He blamed the delay on logistical difficulties, not enough ammunition, problems with the burial sites, concerns about partisan activity in the area. The lies bought time, but time was running out. Berlin grew suspicious. A second courier arrived, demanding to know why the execution had not been confirmed. Brenner sent back more excuses, more delays. He was walking a razor's edge. One wrong word, one suspicious report, and the SS would arrive to carry out the orders themselves. Sister Marie-Thérèse spent those 3 days in constant prayer, real prayer this time, not the calculated manipulation she had used on Brenner. She prayed for the prisoners, for the commandant, for the American soldiers who were fighting their way up the Italian peninsula. She prayed for forgiveness for what she had done, for using forbidden techniques, for manipulating a man's soul to achieve her ends. On the morning of the 4th day, the Americans arrived. The first Sherman tanks rolled into the valley just after dawn, their engines echoing off the mountain walls. The German garrison surrendered without a fight. Most of them had been waiting for exactly this moment, for an excuse to stop fighting a war that everyone knew was lost. Major Brenner personally opened the gates of the POW camp and handed the keys to an astonished American captain. 200 Allied prisoners walked out of that camp alive. British soldiers who had been captured at Tobruk 3 years earlier, American airmen shot down over Sicily, Canadians from the Italian campaign, South Africans, New Zealanders, Australians, men who had spent years behind barbed wire, waiting for liberation or death. They had no idea how close they had come to dying. They had no idea that their lives had been saved by a 57-year-old French nun using a prayer technique that had been forbidden by the Vatican for over a century. The official records show only that the execution orders were never carried out due to logistical delays and the rapid Allied advance. Major Brenner was taken into custody, interrogated, and eventually released. He had committed no war crimes, had in fact prevented one. He returned to Germany, reunited with his children, and lived quietly until his death in 1978. He never spoke publicly about what had happened in his office that day. But in his personal papers, discovered after his death, he left a written account of the encounter with Sister Marie-Thérèse. "She saved my soul," he wrote. "I went into that room a soldier following orders. I came out a man who could still look at himself in the mirror. Whatever technique she used, whatever power she called upon, I will be grateful to her for eternity." Sister Marie-Thérèse returned to the convent and never spoke of what she had done. She confessed the use of directed meditation to her bishop, who absolved her after what he called considerable theological deliberation. The bishop's reasoning was simple. The technique had been banned because it could be used for manipulation and coercion. Sister Marie-Thérèse had used it for salvation, both of the prisoners and of Brenner himself. The letter of the law condemned her. The bishop later wrote, "But the spirit of the law, the protection of innocent life, the redemption of a sinner, was precisely what she had achieved." Sister Marie-Thérèse remained at the convent of St. Agnes until her death in 1967. She never sought recognition for what she had done, never told her story to journalists or historians. When former prisoners came to thank her, and several did, after learning the truth from Brenner's family, she would simply smile and say, "Thank God, not me. I was only his instrument." But the nuns who knew her said she was different after that day. Quieter, more contemplative, as if she was carrying a weight that only she could feel. She spent longer hours in the chapel, praying not the directed meditations she had used on Brenner, but simple, humble prayers of thanksgiving and penance. She saved those men, the Mother Superior said after Sister Marie-Thérèse's death. But I think she always wondered if she had saved herself. She had used a forbidden technique, manipulated a man's soul, lied and deceived in the service of a greater good. She believed it was justified, but she was never entirely certain that God agreed. In 1987, a historian researching POW camps in Italy came across references to the miracle of St. Agnes. In the testimonies of several survivors, he tracked down the story, interviewed the surviving nuns, obtained Brenner's private papers from his family. The book he wrote, published in 1992, finally told the full story of what had happened in that mountain convent in February 1945. The book caused a minor controversy in Catholic circles. Some argued that Sister Marie-Thérèse should be considered for canonization. She had, after all, saved 2,200 lives through an act of extraordinary courage and faith. Others argued that her use of forbidden techniques disqualified her from sainthood. Regardless of the outcome, the Vatican has never ruled on the matter. Sister Marie-Thérèse remains what she was in life, a simple nun who did an extraordinary thing and spent the rest of her days praying for forgiveness for doing it. There's a lesson in Sister Marie-Thérèse's story, though it's not the one you might expect. It's not about faith, though her faith was the foundation of everything she did. It's not about courage, though what she attempted in that commandant's office required courage that most soldiers would envy. The lesson is about understanding. Sister Marie-Thérèse didn't save those prisoners with force or threats or political pressure. She saved them by understanding one man, by seeing past the uniform and the orders and the military discipline, to the frightened Catholic underneath. She found the part of Klaus Brenner that was still capable of mercy, and she awakened it. The generals and the diplomats had tried everything else. They had written letters, issued protests, threatened war crimes trials. None of it had worked, but a nun with a rosary and a forbidden prayer technique accomplished what armies could not. Sometimes the difference between life and death isn't firepower or strategy or political leverage. Sometimes it's just one person understanding another person well enough to find the humanity buried beneath the inhumanity. One nun, one prayer, one impossible choice. 2,200 lives. That's the story they never told you about the last days of the war in Italy. That's the missing page. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Stories like Sister Marie-Thérèse, the forgotten heroes, the ordinary people who did extraordinary things, they deserve to be remembered. If you want to hear more of them, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I read every single one. Until next time.